Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you guys are having a great day. Today I wanted to talk about God's will, God's timing, and see if I could bring a little bit of clarification to it. See, I know we take a look at all those things and we see, well, God's timing, and everybody tells us that things are going to happen in God's timing. If it's God's will, it's going to happen, and that's a pretty neat view, I guess, but in reality we have to begin to examine and understand that we have a free will. Now, having a free will doesn't contradict God's existence of his will. See, God's will and our free will is actually a transaction. See, a transaction, in order for a transaction to exist, both parties must be present. The way I've heard it put was kind of like buying and selling. In order to buy something, there has to be somebody selling something. In order to sell something, somebody has to buy it. It's not something that happens independently of each other, because you can buy all you want, but if nobody's selling it, then the transaction never exists. It never finalizes. Or you can sell something all you want, but if nobody's buying, then what's the point? It has to be finalized. It has to become a transaction that just goes hand in hand. And that's the same thing with God's will. In order for God's will to exist, we have to have free will. In order for our free will to exist, we have to have God's will. And I know what you're thinking. A lot of people are, well, God's will is all that exists, and it doesn't matter. God's will at the end will come to be. And that's pretty cool thinking, I guess. And you start looking at life and you realize that that's not true. We're able to stop God's will. If God's will was the only thing that existed, then there would require no change from us, because at the end of the day, God was gonna do it anyways, right? So what am I gonna do? What part do I have if it's just God's will, and the world would be a perfect place? But it's not. So we know that it's extremely dependent on what we do. It's a transaction. See, when you start looking at people like Moses in the Bible, God's will was for him to set his people free, but the thing was that he still had to get up and go face Pharaoh in the land where he was a fugitive, a land where he was a wanted murderer. So he still had to muster up strength within him and go encounter one of the most powerful men of his time. See, he could have been like, if it's God's will, then I'll just wait here in the wilderness until God brings the Pharaoh to me. But that would have never happened. See, God gave him the strength and said, go and face the Pharaoh. That's the same thing that happens with us. When he tells us what's in his will, it's up to us to carry it out, to finalize the transaction. See, it's kind of like when they say, like, when something's free, why is it free? That means something else has to have a cost. It's free of charge. So if that cost never existed, then free would never exist either. So that's the same thing that we go through life. We interact, we transact with God for him to do it. And a lot of people say, well, no, it's not God's timing, and they sit around being lazy. And you're saying, if it's just God's will, then you can sit around and be lazy. I'm just gonna go to sleep until God creates the business that he has designed for me, until God gives me the organization that he wants me to lead in the world, right? Until God puts me in those places of leadership. But that's not the way it works. See, if I sit around and wait for God's timing to take effect, then it's never going to happen. Now, if I'm acting out of my own will, then God's will never happen either. But we have to remember that God's plan is just a plan until we put it into effect. See, a lot of people are not putting it into effect. We're just allowing time to just go by. So again, it's a transaction. One can't exist without the other. You can't have a buyer without a seller. You can't have a seller without a buyer. And that's the same thing with God's will. We're the ones that are going to finalize the transaction. We can't just sit around. And again, it's not that we do all these other things and it's all about works and let me do it, I don't need God. That's not true. There has to be that time that happens at the same time. It has to happen simultaneously for it to actually work out. At the same time, you have to buy at the same time that they're selling. You have to sell at the same time that they're buying. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And that's the same thing that we do with God's will. So let's not sit around, but let's embrace God's will and actually continue to press forward. So thank you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you guys for tuning in.